Hi, welcome back. We're in Lecture 2, Segment 3. And I'm still talking about correlational research, but this type of correlational research is a little bit different from the first two segments on personality and intelligence. In this segment, I want to talk about an example on the effects of sports-related concussion on cognition and on the brain. So this is an example of medical research. So the effects of concussion, or sports-related concussion in particular, has become a hot topic of research, particularly here in the US, and particularly related to American football. There's been lots of studies recently, especially in the last decade, showing that there are really sort of terrible effects neurally and cognitively for athletes who suffer sports-related concussions, particularly in American football. So how do we study that? Well, these studies look like experiments. So if you think back to the first lecture on experimental research, this setup will look like that setup. So there's what looks like an independent variable, but I'm going to call it a quasi-independent variable. So this treatment, if you will, is whether an athlete suffers a concussion or doesn't suffer a concussion. So we can compare athletes who suffer a concussion to athletes who are very similar to them, play the same exact sport, or the same age, or the same level of expertise, but don't suffer a concussion. So they're the control group. And then we can measure them on several dependent variables. So we can look neurally at measures of the brain, structure and function, and we can look at cognitive measures. So measures of short-term memory and attention are most common. But what's tricky here is this is not a true independent variable in that I don't have random assignment to conditions. That is, I can't, as a researcher, take a group of athletes and randomly assign them to be concussed or not concussed. Right? That'd be sort of fun or evil, but I can't do that. Right? I just have to wait for them to happen as a researcher, and unfortunately, they happen pretty frequently, especially here at Princeton, our football team. They happen pretty quickly. When our football players arrive here in the fall is when they play football in the U.S. They happen very frequently, so it's not too difficult to build up this treatment group. But we just have to wait for it to happen, and it's not random. It's not random assignment to conditions. So that's not a true independent variable. That's really important when you think about making those causal claims about what's causing these changes down here. Is it really the concussion, or is it something else about these athletes that led them to be concussed in the first place? We'll get back to that at the end of the segment. So here's an example of one of the assessments. So once an athlete suffers a concussion, we might ask them something like this. I'm going to assess their concentration or their attention. I'm going to read to you a string of numbers, and when I'm done, you repeat them back to me in reverse order. This is known as backwards digit span in cognitive psychology. So for example, if I say 719, you have to say 917. That's not a great example for New Yorkers. That's the area code in New York. 917, that would be too easy. So if you get that correct, then you go to a longer string length, and you can see down here the different examples that these athletes are given. And when we give this to athletes at baseline, so when athletes come to Princeton, we actually do this. We give them baseline assessments when they first get to Princeton before they start playing a sport. We give them this sort of test. They all do really well. They basically max out on it. Princeton students can do up to like 5, 6 numbers, and they can do it backwards very easily. But after a concussion, after a really bad hit, if they're an American football player, sometimes they're really bad. And so we can look at their change, this pre-post test sort of design, we can look at their change in performance on a test like this before, that is baseline before a concussion, and then post after a concussion. And we can do that for a control group. We can give them this test once at the beginning of the season and then say randomly at some point during the season, but they haven't suffered a concussion, so we can use them as a comparison group for the group that did suffer concussion. So what we typically see in these types of studies is that the concussed athletes perform much worse on these measures of short-term memory, attention. Also, balance is a good measure. So once right after an athlete suffers a hit, if you give them a balance test where they just have to stand on one leg, they can't do it for very long. Like right now, I'm doing it fine. I wasn't concussed this morning. So, but if I was concussed, I would just like do that very quickly. And that's a very good assessment, actually, of concussion. So it looks like we have pretty nice causal claims that the hit caused performance on this balance test or this attention test, the backward digit span. But there are potential confounds, right? Because we don't have a true independent variable. There could be other variables that are leading to this result. So one problem, and this is a problem we've dealt with in the research here at Princeton, is lots of these athletes have suffered concussions before. So is it really this one hit that caused them to become suddenly really off balance or suddenly interrupt their short-term memory? Or is it the cumulative effect of several hits, and this one being the one that really finally caused this damage? So is it this one hit or this history of concussions? We don't know because we don't have true random assignment to conditions. We can look at their history of prior concussions and try and tease that apart, but it's not as strong as a true experiment, right? That's more like correlational research. That's why it's here in this lecture on correlational research. Is this kind of thing looks like a true experiment, but it's not. Okay, so be very careful, especially as consumers of research and consumers of statistics, be very careful to be able to spot sort of correlational research that's dressed up as experimental research. So this is a great example of that. Is it looks like experimental research because you have people who were concussed and people who weren't. That looks like a nice experimental group and control group, but they weren't randomly assigned to conditions. So deep down, it's just correlational research. It's really no different from the intelligence research that I mentioned and the personality research that I mentioned. Okay, so this is open up to lots of different types of confounds. In particular, there might be certain personality types that are more likely to put themselves in a position where they're susceptible to this concussion. So maybe certain personality types that are more aggressive, for example, in American football, are more likely to become concussed than others. And maybe aggressive people have certain types of brain structure or function or certain types of or perform cognitive measures differently than others. We don't know, again, because this isn't as sort of tight as the true experimental research like the polio vaccine trials. So again, the main point of this segment is to point out quasi-independent variables. And again, since the independent variable doesn't involve random representative sampling, arguments about causality aren't as strong. And that's the main thing to take away from this segment. To summarize the entire lecture, just recognize the distinction between correlational research and experimental research as we go forward and start to get more into the statistics. This first week has been mostly about methods, but as I said, as consumers of statistics, or now that you're about to become people who are skilled in doing statistics, it's important to know what type of research are you engaging in. Are you engaging in experimental research, or correlational research. And again, I'll refer to correlational research as studies and experimental research as simply experiments. The main important concepts to take away are that theories of personality and intelligence, those have been supported by investigating patterns of correlations obtained from observational correlational studies. And some things we just simply can't manipulate ethically, right? So we can't just take people to a football field and randomly assign them to be concussed or not concussed. There are lots of things like gender, male, female, religious affiliation. I can't randomly assign those things to people. The people come to my laboratory or to a laboratory setting just with those traits or characteristics. We can't randomly assign them. So those are quasi-independent variables, and they fall under the category of correlational research. So those are the main concepts to take away from this segment and from this first week.